You're listening to the Scribe podcast. My name is Julia Jackson. I'm the managing editor for the Scribe.
This is Taylor Burnfield. I'm the website manager.
And this is Devin Martinez, and I am the sports editor at the Scribe.
And we are all sort of here just to discuss Hispanic Heritage Month, because all of us have Hispanic heritage, and it's something that we deemed important to talk about. Hispanic Heritage Month runs from September 15th through October 15th. And the reasoning behind those dates, for those curious, is just sort of September 15th corresponds to a bunch of independence dates in Latin America. But for those of us living in the States, it just becomes a time when we can celebrate our heritage and sort of reflect back on the experiences of our families and ourselves in this country. But yeah. So to start out with, we're just going to discuss sort of what Hispanic Heritage Month means to each of us. Do you want to start?
I can go first. Yeah, so I think for me, Hispanic Heritage Month is something I really look forward to every year because I grew up in Texas, and unfortunately a lot of the stereotypes about Texas and the South are true. Like, there is a lot of prejudice there, and there is a lot of prejudice against Hispanic people because Texas is in such close proximity to Mexico, and there's just a lot of negative stereotypes about Mexican people and just Latin America in general. And growing up, I definitely dealt with that a lot, and like whenever I would talk about my heritage, like I definitely got a lot of negative feedback about that, or just like misconceptions people had about my background. And so I feel like Hispanic Heritage Month is a really good time to just educate people about not just Mexico, but just other Latin American countries, and just breaking down a lot of the stereotypes that still exist in the media, unfortunately. So for me, that's what Hispanic Heritage Month is about, is just educating people.
I would say that Hispanic Heritage Month is something that's newer to me. I just figured out about it like a couple years ago. Kind of embarrassed that it took so long. But for me, last year was the first year where I actually really thought about it, because before it was like, I'm just not somebody who really thought about like where I came from. I just was like, oh, I'm part Mexican, I'm part this, I'm part that. I never really like actually thought about it. So last year was the first year where I was like, oh my gosh, like I really just took a second to really appreciate where I've come from, and my family and that side of my family, and to like just to appreciate it on a different level than I never actually did.
Sort of on the same page as Devin, I really only started thinking about Hispanic Heritage Month more recently, but in my mind, it's, I guess because of the nature of the setting that we're in, like going to a university here, like it's, like Taylor was saying, it's an opportunity to educate and like sort of delve into more resources about like Hispanic culture, and about like how that intersects with like what's thought of as American culture, and just like doing more research and reading, and also listening to like the perspectives of other Hispanic people online who are sort of like having these discussions, but like the discussions haven't become fully mainstream yet, and so that's sort of what we're tackling here, I think. But yeah, I think it's just a valuable opportunity to do that and like appreciate where we come from. Something that comes up when we talk about Hispanic Heritage Month is sort of the idea of like, what does the term Hispanic really mean? And like in recent years, there's been sort of a push in the US more than in Latin American countries, I think, to use the term Latinx or Latinx, or however you want to say it. And there's also like pushback against that, but it's about sort of finding what would be the best term, because like Hispanic connotes Spain, and
Yeah.
we're quite a ways out from that.
Yeah.
And sort of like to center the importance of like a Latin American identity as opposed to a Hispanic identity would mean like changing that term a little bit. So we just wanted to talk about that.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think there is some controversy over the term Hispanic Heritage Month. Like some people want to include the term Latin into that, so it's Hispanic and Latin Heritage Month, and I think I don't have an issue with that. I think that's a good idea because I think that encompasses more people because Hispanic is kind of limiting in who it's referring to.
Mm-hmm. Any thoughts?
I guess I don't know what the perfect word is, and I guess I'm a little annoyed by people pretending that they have found the perfect word and the entire conversation is over. I believe that there's been several polls where like it's shown that like not a lot of people who label themselves so Hispanic or Latin really like the term Latinx, and it comes from the position of just like a lot of them disagree with it for the fact of they weren't part of the conversation to even create the term in the first place. So I think that the conversation over what terms to use, there's still a lot more breathing room. So I don't really have an opinion on what term should be used or what's the end all. I know I'm someone who always likes specific things, and I think sometimes it's really hard to come up with a term that encompasses everybody and makes everybody happy. I know the way I view Hispanic Heritage Month, I look at it from the perspective of just Mexican. Well, someone may look at it from
I'm Peruvian.
Peruvian, yeah. So it's all in those two cultures are very different in themselves as well.
Yeah. My take on it is also from sort of a linguistic perspective. Just that is part of the reason why Latinx has caught traction here in the U.S., but not so much in Latin American countries, is because the X doesn't work with how you pronounce words in Spanish. And like an alternative that I've seen to that is like addressing the question of whether Latinx is like meant to be a gender neutral term, even though like the root Latin would already be gender neutral. I think Taylor sort of falls more on that end.
Yeah.
But you could also use the term Latine, which like the e in Spanish serves as a neutral, like when you're using pronouns as well as when you're conjugating, not conjugating, but like making your adjectives match your subject. It just works all around. But I haven't really experienced its use very much, and so it feels like a very new thing, and I don't really have like a perspective on whether it is or not. But it's just another thing that sort of exists in this arena, and it's an option to talk about.
Yeah, and I think language, is evolving all the time, so I don't think we have to say, like, okay, this is the word we're going to use right now, we're going to use this word forever, because, like, language is always changing. So, like, I think it's kind of dangerous to be like, okay, this is the term we've decided on, we're going to use this from now on, because, language always changes, so...
You had mentioned like the term Hispanic didn't start to be used on like the U.S. Census until the 1970s or something like that, and it was sort of like the origin of that term was basically imposed by the government and like, being a box that you can fit yourself into because like we, I guess, have this idea that we should like make these neat categories, even though like the majority of people don't fall squarely into one or the other.
Yeah, like that's the thing. Like I feel like the government or like other institutions kind of force these labels onto people and just says, okay, these are your 4 to 5 choices and this is all you have. But like people are more complex than that. And I feel like people, like if we're talking about government forms and things like that, I think people should be able to just write in whatever they want instead of having to choose from like 4 little boxes. And yeah, so like with the term Hispanic, that really didn't start to come into use until the 70s. Before the 70s, there really wasn't an option you could choose, and that word Hispanic was just, something that the government created, but I don't think they ever actually talked to people and said like, well, what do you call yourself, and I think that's a problem that's still going on, is I feel like these kind of higher institutions are just like coming up with terms and just forcing them on people and not really having conversations with people and asking them like what they prefer to be called. And I think that's a good conversation to have. And some people, maybe they don't prefer Hispanic, maybe they don't prefer Latinx either, maybe there's something else. And I think just talking to people, I think that's really what we should be doing is just talking to people instead of just saying, okay, this is what I think this is the word I think we should use.
Yeah, to go off your point, I think it's because language changes naturally.
Yeah.
It doesn't change when it's imposed.
Yeah, that's
If
true.
Hispanic, Latinx, whatever the new term is, like, it should be a natural shift. It shouldn't be like, well, language changes, but it's like, yeah, it does, but not in this way.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because I remember growing up, my dad was like, "You're not Hispanic, you're Mexican." It was a very specific thing on that. So I don't know. I wonder how difficult it is to actually come up with something that's is able to bring, because even though the experiences of everyone is completely different, being having family from that part of the world and being in America is definitely a different experience, and that doesn't matter if you're Mexican or you're Peruvian or wherever your family comes from. Like, everyone I've talked to, like, some of the experiences are very similar.
Yeah.
Especially being mixed in America.
Yeah.
Under that.
For sure. So we'll sort of circle back to this discussion about like being mixed and all of that a little bit later. But for right now, why don't we just sort of address like, why is Hispanic Heritage Month important to us? What are our like specific backgrounds? Because we've been referencing them, but I think the listeners should probably just get to hear our stories a little bit.
I can go first. So my mom's side of my family, my grandmother's side specifically, is from Mexico. And I grew up in Texas, and there is a very strong Mexican presence in Texas because Texas is right next to Mexico. And growing up, I would openly talk about my background because I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. But as I got older, I learned like sometimes other people like would kind of force this like shame on me, like they wanted me to feel ashamed or embarrassed of my background, and I never accepted that. I was like, no, this is who I am. I'm not gonna like hide who I am to make you more comfortable, and like growing up, I heard a lot of like just negative comments like, oh, your family came here and they're not legal citizens and blah blah blah, stuff like that. Just like really like negative derogatory statements people would make about that side of my family. And then even growing up, hearing stories that my grandmother would tell me or my great-grandmother would tell me about just like racist experiences they would have, like just stories where they had experienced discrimination. Like I remember my mom telling me the story about my grandmother was looking for an apartment in San Antonio, Texas, and she had gone to this apartment complex and asked them, oh, do you have any available apartments? And like the salesperson, who was a white woman, told her, oh no, all the apartments are sold. We don't have any apartments available. And like my mom, who is, she looks white, she has blonde hair, blue eyes, she was suspicious of that. So she went to that same apartment complex and asked her like, oh, is there an apartment available? And the lady told her, oh yeah, we have tons of apartments available. So, and that happened in the 80s. So like that wasn't really that long ago. But I mean, just growing up hearing stories like that, and then just my own experiences with people whenever I would open up about my background, just a lot of the negative stereotypes that people have, and just the misunderstandings people have about Mexican culture. I think Hispanic Heritage Month is important to me because I just think it's important to educate people, about Hispanic culture and about Mexican culture. And I feel like something that always bothered me growing up is a part of my family is, Italian, a part of my family is Scottish, a part of my family is Polish. And like whenever I would talk about those sides of my family, there was never any negative feedback I got from that. And yet when I would talk about the Mexican side of my family, it was always negative feedback. And I feel like in kind of the public school system, there's a lot of education about Europe. Like we learn a lot about Europe, and I feel like people understand like, okay, Italian culture is different than Polish culture, and Polish culture is different than, Russian culture or whatever. But when it comes to like Latin American culture, there's this idea that like it's all the same, and that, it's all bad. Like there's always this negative idea about Latin America. And so I think just spreading awareness and spreading education about that is really important.
I would say that my experience is, I just feels weird. So my mom's French and black. My dad's Mexican and white. Sometimes we joke Mexican and redneck. But, cause with that, it was just completely normal to me. So I thought everyone else's families were like that, but that's clearly not true. And also it's always strange because I'm a white guy with blue eyes, so no one really knows that about me. And then the only thing that someone could know if I am Mexican is if they see my last name, Martinez. But yeah, it's always been kind of a fun experience because it's like I've always felt like an outsider, especially if I'm around. Even if I'm around some friends of mine that are their entire family is completely Mexican, I feel like an outsider in some perspective over there. I feel like an outsider if I'm just around a bunch of people who are just white, and it's definitely a unique experience to have all four sides of my family, and also just knowing that like a lot of like the racism that persisted like a lot of it was just doesn't feel like it was supposed to happen. Like the interracial marriages in my family and how difficult that was. I know my grandmother, she grew up in the South, and it was not a good idea for her to marry a man that's Mexican. And according to a lot of things in our family and all those struggles and growing up and hearing that, it definitely just makes you very appreciative for who you are and everyone before you who had to go through all that discrimination for you to just be there. So I'm very appreciative of my experience and of living through that experience, especially, and I hope that more people will be able to experience that. I know that the U.S. demographics are changing. There's a lot more interracial marriages and families, and more people are experiencing that. It's a unique perspective, and it really just makes you more thankful for things in America.
As far as my experience, it's my mom's side of the family is Peruvian. My mom she was born in Peru. She came to the U.S. like a couple of years before I was born. But the sort of different perspective that I have on this is I've just experienced like a very big disconnect from my culture growing up, because my mom, when she got here, her mentality was very much like fitting in, trying to do things the American way. And so that sort of like, she never talked much about like what her life was like in Peru. And I've only sort of started to pick up bits and pieces of that now that I'm older, you know. And like, I've been to Peru, I visited 3 times, and like that was the first time that I had met my grandparents there, you know. But even with that, even though like I've since learned to speak Spanish and I've like tried to do so much like research about it, research only gets you so far. Like when you live somewhere else, it becomes harder to stay connected to that place. And like the other thing is, I know it's hard on my mom too, especially like to be separated from her family and to like not be able to express her culture. And like I know that she is repressing it in many ways because of like the racism that you experience here in the US for those things. But yeah, beyond that, it's like my Hispanic heritage or my Peruvian heritage, you know, it's something that I've had to work very hard to get in touch with, you know. And similar to Taylor and Devin, like I am white passing, but then that like it's a weird gray area with that too, because when I'm standing next to my mom, like I look Peruvian, but then when I'm standing next to my dad, I look white. And so it's like that also largely depends on where you grow up, and like growing up in rural Georgia was very different to when I moved here to Colorado. So there are so many different factors at play in like what makes a Latin American identity, what makes like a Latin U.S. American identity, you know. And I think it's really valuable to hear other people's stories, because there are so many stories like ours, and then there are so many stories that are not like ours. There are like first-hand accounts of people who are first-generation immigrants to the U.S. And like that, I want to be clear that that's like its own very different thing that deserves like a voice to speak about it. It's just that we don't have anyone with that experience on staff. But I'm very much enjoying like hearing the perspectives that are in this room. I think that's very valuable in and of itself.
I mean, like, yeah, it's even like I mentioned, I've had a mostly positive experience. I haven't had many people say anything to me because of that. Of course, there's always at least one person you walk into who's very vocal. I'm curious. Have you had any? You said a lot of that was in Texas. Has any of that happened in Colorado?
No, I haven't
Yeah.
had that happen in Colorado. And I remember my grandmother actually told me, because my family is originally from Colorado Springs. My family immigrated from Mexico in the 1920s to Colorado Springs, and then they moved to Texas in the 80s. So that's how I ended up growing up in Texas. But I remember my grandmother told me, like in Colorado, they didn't really have any issues with racism in Colorado. But then when they moved to Texas was really the first time they were treated differently because they were Mexican.
That's really interesting. Like having been living in Colorado and then going in closer proximity to the border, like creates a much more different dynamic between people. It seems like. Yeah,
I mean, overall, Colorado's pretty open. Of course, I bet there are stories out there. As you said, there's definitely thousands of stories, and there definitely is, people who are racist in the state. But overall, it's a pretty open state, and a lot of people seem to be very interested. You know, every time because people just see me. You even said, you're like, I thought you were just a typical white guy. But like the minute someone sees my last name Martinez, they like, sometimes, not every time, but sometimes people will ask me about it. They're like, oh, I didn't know you were part Mexican. And then I'm like, oh yeah. And then it's a conversation that people are interested in hearing versus I lived in Texas for a bit and it wasn't like that. Even in Austin, Texas.
That's good. Yeah, I mean, I grew up in Dallas, so I don't know. Maybe it depends on what part of Texas you live in, but...
Yeah.
In Texas, did people usually like assume you were white or assume that you were Mexican, or like both?
Oh, in Texas, there wasn't ever a surprise. I think just because, especially in Austin, there's just more mixed people in Texas in general.
Yeah.
Especially in Austin. Austin's a pretty open city.
It is, yeah.
But here, there seems to not be as many. So I think the fact that like in Austin, Texas, I think they were like more open to the idea of like, that makes sense that if you know
like
more,
the norm,
it's the norm, yeah.
Yeah.
Which is another thing you get when you get closer to the border. Even though that you hear more stories about people being disgusting, you also hear like, oh, there's a lot more mixed. There's still a lot of people who share that experience. I don't know if it was like that in Dallas, but
I think for me, most of my negative experiences with like people having negative ideas about Mexican people, that didn't really happen until I moved out to kind of a smaller town. Because like I grew up in kind of the Dallas area, which is like a really big city. It's very diverse, and I didn't really have any bad experiences there. But then when I was in high school, my family moved kind of out in the middle of nowhere to like a really, really small town, and I went to high school in a really small town where it was like 100 people at my high school, and it was like pretty much everybody was white. And like when my brother and I started going to school there, like my brother looks very Hispanic. Like we don't really look related. And people would naturally ask like, oh, why does your brother look different? Like, is he your stepbrother? And I'd be like, no, like our mom is part Mexican, blah, blah, blah. And I would like tell our story. And then that's when the racism would come out and they would say negative things. And I was like really confused by that. Like, why do people have such a negative opinion about Mexican people? And now as I've gotten older and I kind of look back on that, I think those people, I mean, they were high school aged kids, they were young. I think they were kind of just repeating what their parents probably told them. And I think also growing up in a really small town where they probably had never met like somebody who was not white, they just, the only thing they knew was what they saw like in the media or what their parents told them. And I'm not making excuses for them, but I'm just saying like that probably played a part in their reaction. And hopefully, like I haven't kept in touch with any of those people. Hopefully now that they've grown up and they're adults, hopefully they're more like open-minded, but I don't know.
And also, I also don't see anything you said as like making excuses for them. It's just understanding, like trying to understand where they're, especially high schoolers, a negative perspective like that, because that's not a fully developed human. Probably repeating what their parents are saying. Which is sad.
Well, sort of on the topic of like Texas and being closer to the border, I know you have a lot of stories about like Mexican food specifically, like that's something that's very big in your family, and I figured it would be neat for us to just sort of share those like things about our cultures that we are familiar with and like feel very personal to us.
So my family's from Phoenix. And I know like one thing about Mexican food that I've just been learning about. I've been learning how to cook everything from enchiladas to tamales to the red chili burritos. Everything's amazing. I mean, I'm not the best cook yet. I'm not saying what I'm making is amazing yet, but it's all just a part of like my diet, and it always be a part of my diet. So with Mexican food, you know, I always get really annoyed when somebody says, sorry, there's a little bit of a rant coming, but it's like people are just like, I love authentic Mexican food, but I'm like, what do you mean? You know, there's different types of Mexican food that's authentic. The authentic Mexican food that I grew up on is called Sonoran, and it comes from the northern part of Mexico next to Arizona. So it's a mixture. It's a Mexican American food that was developed by Mexican Americans, and also just the entire region developed it. And that's to me what is authentic. But I'm not going to say that I love authentic Mexican food. I just love Sonoran authentic Mexican food. But there's so many different types of Mexican food. And it goes back to what was mentioned earlier. It's just like inside of Mexico, just like inside of America, there's different types of American food. There's different types of Mexican food depending on the region. Same thing across South America. Like, people are different from everything, and it goes with the food. And I guess that's not really much of a rant. Just like a thing of like, just like, hey, if you go up to someone and say you like authentic Mexican food, just be authentic. Just be knowledge. Like, have a little bit of knowledge on what that means, and also like and also the type of food that you like, because I've tried some other Mexican food from somebody else, and their family came from a different part of Mexico. I did not like it. Doesn't mean I don't like authentic Mexican food. Just means I like the one that I grew up on. Yeah, which makes a lot of sense. Yeah, and Sonoran basically, it's the one where they just throw red chili on everything. It's just like red chili on the rice, but the beans, everything. It's just I really love that.
Do you guys prefer red chilies or green chilies?
Red chili.
I don't like chilies that much.
Oh, I like the green chilies.
I'm a fake Latin American.
That's, I guess, a controversy. Like, I didn't know that was like
I'm the
thing.
Fake one. I can't speak Spanish. So.
No, I mean, I can handle. That's another interesting thing. Like, spicy Latin American food, I can eat just fine. Whereas like Mediterranean spicy food or like Asian spicy food, I'm very bad at. But
That's interesting.
I'm just not that big of a fan of spicy in general. But like, doesn't mean I don't like spices. I'm not completely white. But I don't know. For me, what bit of culture that I've like absorbed from my mom is less of the food side and more sort of on the literary side. I've spent a lot of time like I said, research doesn't get you all the way there to understanding your own culture, but it can be like an integral part of it. And so I've done a lot of like studying not only Peruvian literature but also just like Latin American literature as a whole, and like poetry especially, and that's something that's like the language of Spanish for me is very important, and like learning sort of the history of like my country as well as like all of Latin America, that's sort of my favorite thing, because it's like like Taylor mentioned earlier, it's something that we just aren't taught in like grade school, and you have to sort of really seek it out when you're like only being taught European history essentially.
Yeah.
What about you? What's your favorite?
I think
cultural thing?
my favorite component of like Mexican culture is the music. Like growing up, I listened to so much like different types of Latin music. I'm surprised that I'm not able to speak Spanish because so
Yeah.
much of the music I listened to growing up was in Spanish. But I love not just music that's like from Mexico, but just Latin music in general. Like I love like Cuban music and Puerto Rican music, and I love probably one of my favorite genres is bossa nova, which is a type of jazz that came from Brazil. And I love like flamenco, like the Spanish guitar. I love bolero, which is kind of like a Mexican like folk music. But I just love all different types of Latin music, and
That's
I
really interesting.
grew up listening to so many different artists, and I really wish I spoke Spanish so I could understand the lyrics, but I think the music is what really kind of helps me feel connected to my culture, because like most of my Mexican relatives that I was really close to, they've all passed away, but they like introduced me to so many different types of music. So like when I listen to that music, it just makes me feel closer to them.
Yeah, it's a way of keeping them with you.
Yeah.
One other thing I thought of, just like from the few times that I've been to Peru, like it feels inauthentic, like I'm treating these as souvenirs more than anything. But one of the like biggest, not biggest, that's the wrong word. I'm thinking about Peruvian street markets and like open air markets, and how that's like, it's such a different thing from what you would see in the States. But like there's open air markets like for food, but then there's also like there's a lot of craftsmanship that comes from Peru, and like the process of bartering with people to sort of get like 5 soles off of your like blanket that you're trying to buy, just things like that sort of stick with me about that experience of having visited, and also like the physical things that I have, like alpaca wool blankets especially, those are so cozy. And also like my cats agree, and like those are like their favorite blankets, and I just find that cute, and it's something that like, I don't know, like when I'm just alone and like doing my own thing, like going about my day and like snuggled up in one of those, it's like a little bit of a reminder. So
Yeah.
I
I
like that.
absolutely love this because it's literature, music, and food. Like
Yeah,
Yeah.
we've
we're
got-
really, yeah.
we've covered the whole spectrum.
I also want to add alcohol. I love tequila. Love margaritas, which was actually created by Mexican miners
Ooh.
and Mexican American miners. I don't know if it was immigrant. I'm sorry. I'm just want to make sure I get it more correct. But in Arizona, that were
Oh, I
in
didn't
the
know
mines in
that.
Arizona during
Like
the
margaritas as a drink? Or-
yeah, it was developed by some miners in the mountains in Arizona by Mexican miners, and I just find that so interesting.
Right.
That's cool.
This isn't, I mean, I'm not of age, so I can't technically talk that much about alcohol, but I know from my mom, one of the things that she buys from time to time is called Pisco Sour, and it's like kind of hard to find here.
Oh.
But it's like a very Peruvian alcohol, and it's made from like, it's made a very particular way in the mountains, and I can't remember what it is, but like a different sort of, it's not, just a different sort of fermentation process. And there's also a whole like little bit of a cultural war between Peru and Chile, because like each one of them claims to have made the Pisco Sour first, and it's a whole thing.
Do you know like what type of food is popular in Peru? Because I don't really know much about their food.
Yeah, a lot of it, well, no. You'll find sort of similar things, I think, but in the way that like a lot of Mexican food has like the staples of, meat, rice, beans, tortilla, cheese, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And, like your chilies, obviously.
Yeah.
Peruvians, like, their staple dish like that is ceviche, which is like basically a kind of fish with like a lemon marinade on it. And that's because like Peru is coastal too, you know, so Mexico is also coastal, obviously,
Yeah.
but that's sort of like what Devin was talking about. You'll get different sorts of food from different regions. But like Lima is right on the coast, and so they have a lot of like fish, especially.
And Sonoran does not have any fish since
Right.
it's on the northern tip of the border
Right.
near Arizona.
Huh. Yeah.
Makes sense.
It's all very like, I don't know.
What about tamales? Do you have tamales for Christmas?
Well, growing up, we always made menudo.
Oh.
And I became a vegetarian when I was really young. So, like,
Wow.
I'm kind of limited in what I can eat, like, with
Right.
Mexican food, because a lot of it does have meat. But menudo is, like, a soup that has, like, the organs of
Mhm.
animals, like, in the soup.
Yeah.
Which
It's really good.
I don't agree.
I know.
But, I mean, yeah, I like tamales, like, with cheese. I mean, that's good. And, like, chili rellenos.
Yeah, you
with
kind of
cheese.
have to go with green chilies since green
Yeah.
chilies are vegetarian.
Yeah.
Mostly.
Yeah, and I remember my great grandmother. I never met her, but I was always told like that she would always make fried cauliflower. Like I guess that was her thing. I don't know if that was just something she made or if that's like a traditional Mexican dish. But she would always like bread. She would like bread the cauliflower and like fry it.
Mm-hmm. The most common thing, like Peruvian dish that I had growing up was arroz con pollo, which it just means chicken and rice, and that's what it is.
That's awesome.
Except it's like with a little cilantro sauce on the rice, and so like the whole dish looks sort of green, but it's really good. I like it a lot. I'm trying to think of anything else. There's it's like a soda, so it doesn't feel that traditional, but it's called Inca Cola, and it's made with like this root from up in the mountains that's it has a very like bubblegum taste, but the drink is like bright yellow.
Really?
And like I've only recently started to like hunt it down here, but that was like one of my favorite foods, drinks, whatever, when I visited.
That's cool.
One of the coolest things I've heard is one of my friends went to Mexico, and there was like a place that was serving fried mashed potatoes in a taco in Mexico, and I'm like, that sounds like innovative. Fried mashed potatoes and cheese, unhealthy,
Yeah.
in a corn tortilla, and I'm like, that's innovative.
I really miss a lot of the Mexican food trucks we had in Texas, especially in Austin. Like I remember there's this one food truck I went to, and like the people who were working in the food truck didn't speak English, so like I tried to explain to them like I'm a vegetarian. I don't think they understood me. They gave me something. It was good, whatever it was. I don't know what it was called. It was like kind of like a sandwich. It was like this really good bread, and then inside of it was like avocados and potatoes and like different vegetables and like this really good like green chili sauce, and I don't know what it was called, but that was really good.
Now my stomach's growling.
Yeah, I'm getting hungry. We've also got here like to talk about like misconceptions about our cultures. I feel like we've touched on that a lot already, but do we feel like there's anything else to say on that? I had like a point or two.
You can go first and then I can go.
Okay. I was gonna say like we addressed this briefly earlier, but there's something about how like when you learn about European cultures, you're taught like they're very distinct things, whereas when you learn about like Latin America, you just sort of lump it all together. To the point that like that was something I experienced growing up, was like when I was like, oh yeah, like I'm Hispanic, people would say, oh, so you're Mexican? And this was like primarily in like white rural Georgia, you know, so again, same thing as you brought up, like it's a matter of like people's perspectives being limited by not knowing other people. But like a lot of the time when I tried to express like, no, my she's from Peru, like people don't know where that is, or like less so now. Like I think I keep more educated company these days, but like I don't know. So it's an interesting thing of like, because like Mexican American culture is sort of like the dominant Latin culture here in the States. It
Especially,
creates an interesting, like, people want to think of it all as homogenous, whereas like there are actually like little pockets of like separate like Latin communities within the greater Latin community.
yeah, and I was just going to say, especially like in the West and like the Southwest, it's definitely, there's a stronger Mexican presence. But if you lived maybe in like Florida, there'd be more of like a Puerto Rican, Cuban presence. Yeah.
I have a friend who's an immigrant from Venezuela, and he got so mad about things like that just growing up, because like it was just the automatic assumption.
Right.
So you're not alone on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, kind of going off of what Devin was saying earlier, like Mexico is such a big country, and like I feel like, you know, most people in the United States, we understand like the United States is a melting pot. We have all these different cultures and everything, and it's like Mexico, I believe, is just as big, if not bigger, than the United States. So it's like it's just as diverse, and not just Mexico, but all the other countries. I mean, Brazil, Argentina, like those are huge countries, and even like the smaller countries, I'm sure, are very diverse, and that's just something I wish people could really grasp, is like not everyone from Latin America is the same. And we kind of talked about this a little bit yesterday, like talking about religion, like, you know, there's this idea that like everybody's Catholic, and I mean most people from Latin America are Catholic, but there's also a very strong Jewish presence in Latin America also. And the first synagogue in the Americas was actually in, I think it was Brazil.
That makes sense.
I'm actually going to bring up a stereotype of people in Latin America that I don't have too much problem with. I just think that it needs to be evolved. Is the idea that people that come from Latin America are hard workers. I think it's very true. I think that the way that it needs to evolve is that it's only a hard worker in the sense of, you know, working really long hours in construction and things like that. I think it's going to just change naturally for the fact that that as generations of immigrant people that were immigrants are, you know, going to college, going to school, and working in different fields. But I just know, like, everyone on my side of the family that's on that side of the family, extremely hard workers. A lot of people. It's a really cool thing it's not a bad thing that people view. It's just the fact that people only view it from a blue collar perspective.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's gonna be something I think is gonna evolve towards any color.
Right. Yeah. No, it's very much, it still feels like an assumption, like your construction people and your like people who take care of the lawn, like those are the kinds of jobs that people envision Latin American people having, and that's not like the definition of hard work is not menial work. It's not like the worst work that we can throw off on people because they'll accept lower wages because they're struggling to get by, you know. So, yeah.
But at the same time, it's like still Latin American people I think are very hard workers.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Something that I was going to say that you reminded me of just about like the diversity within Mexico itself is like people have an image of what a person from Mexico or from any part of Latin America looks like, and it's like it's very limiting, because like there are people who are like people born in Mexico who are white too, like, and I feel like people
with blue eyes.
Yeah, white with blue eyes. People just like don't make that connection because like they don't think of it as like it's very much like the US in a lot of ways, you know. There you just have people who look different. You have a lot of like black Mexicans, you have black Latin Americans, like everything. People are so interconnected. Like this is an example more specific to Peru. Peru has a lot of Japanese immigration. Like even the most recent president was a Japanese Peruvian, and so that's like its own thing, like where people, like you can't assume just based on someone's name or based on what they look like what their background is. You have to actually like sit down and have a conversation with them like we're doing now.
Yeah, like the most popular boxer right now in Mexico is half Irish. Canelo. was his name, and he's a lot of people were surprised. I remember you even see comments today of like wait, he has red hair. He's a Mexican boxer. It's like yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's
yeah.
just genetics. Like,
yeah.
they're crazy, you know, but we can't control them, and they just turn out that way.
I also have a really cool fact. So
About your Mexican boxer?
No, not the Mexican boxer, but about so apparently in the 1800s there was a migration towards Mexico from Mormons in the U.S. because of the laws about marriage.
Okay.
So a lot of them moved to Mexico, and there's a lot of people in Mexico because of that who, you know, are white, but they're Mexican because of that big migration. And actually, Mitt Romney's father was actually born in Mexico. He was a part of that.
Huh.
And that there was talks about him running for president, but he couldn't because his dad had moved to Mexico due to the marriage laws in the United States.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah.
And that reminded me too, like in terms of like if you think about it, like where did white people in Latin America come from, you know? And like some people have the assumption that people from Spain look like the same image of Latin American people that they have, when that's not true.
True.
Like people from Spain largely look European.
Yeah.
And it was that mixing of like the European look with mainly the indigenous look and the black look in Latin America that created like what your like typical image, like typical listener are thinking of when we say like a Latin American person.
Yeah, and there was a lot of French immigration to Mexico also.
Right.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Oh yeah, I mean, isn't there a couple of South American countries that French is their language?
yeah.
Yeah.
There are a couple.
Is it Papua Guinea?
I think so, yeah. I don't know very much about it, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I mean, that's a whole thing too, is like when we say Latin America, like that's Brazil also, and in Brazil you
That's
speak
true.
Portuguese rather than Spanish, and that's a whole other like subculture.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I have one more random fact. I'm so sorry.
Yeah,
Just, but you know the most popular movie star in South America is
Who?
Adam Sandler.
Really?
Yeah. Apparently, like his his movies do the best in South America always, and there's a huge following for him in South America. And I've always thought
really
that was
funny.
an interesting factoid of like, because I'm like, oh, I'm also a huge Adam Sandler fan.
Do you know what the most popular music in Mexico is?
No.
Heavy metal.
Oh,
A friend told me that. Like, that's like the most popular music in Mexico is heavy metal.
That's
really?
interesting.
So our listeners got a bunch of random facts.
Yeah. This is your education for the day.
Outside of Hispanic Heritage Month, here are the facts.
Yeah. But yeah, I feel like we've had a really good conversation, and like we've said, like we're sort of modeling like the importance of having these conversations, you know, like just asking people what their backgrounds are regardless. I mean, like not in an invasive way. Like I don't want to encourage you to walk up to somebody and be like, where are you from? Like don't do that.
Yeah.
But like with a friend, you know, like it's always fun to sit down and hear like where somebody's family is from, and
Yeah.
like what does that mean to them. Like we've talked about food and music and literature, like what are their favorite things about that background if it's something that is an important factor in their life.
And also knowing no matter where you come from, you should never feel bad about your background.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the important thing is to just not make assumptions about people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. I don't know if we want to end on that note. I can give a little sign off, and Camille, please edit out the part we were talking about signing
We've
off.
been talking for almost 50 minutes, so I
Okay.
think we're good to wrap this up.
Plenty to work with. Okay, so this has been the Scribe podcast. I'm Julia Jackson,
I'm Taylor Burnfield.
And I'm Devin Martinez.
and thank you for listening to our discussion of Hispanic Heritage Month.
Don't forget to follow us on social media at UCCS Scribe.
Yes.